History of the African American Funeral, presented by Skylar Black, Melody Cranford, and Cecilia Sasser. The history of the African American funeral begins with Egyptian customs. First of all, embalming. Embalming in the Egyptian custom was used for two primary reasons. First of all, it was the thought that immorality of the soul began with the embalming process. It was also used as sanitation of the body. Next, the sarcophagus, which led to the creation of the coffin, and in the African American community, pieces of stick and wood put together to form a wooden box for the deceased to be placed in. In the Egyptian customs, burials took place in pyramids. However, in the African American communities, they had to adapt and began to bury their dead in the ground. The overall gist of the Egyptian customs was to keep the honor and respect due to the deceased. African American history of the funeral also embeds West African roots. First of all, the bathing ritual. Women in the African community would use oils and spices such as lavender in the water to bathe the deceased body. They had to perform the bathing ritual before the body could be touched by anyone else or removed from wherever the deceased first died. Also in the West African community, gift ceremonies were performed where all the people in the community would bring gifts and place them inside the burial ground with the deceased body before the body was covered with dirt. Also, there was a mourning ritual where the women would cover themselves in ashes and wail and mourn and cry for up to 2 hours after the body was placed into the ground. After the wailing ceremony, dirt was covered over the bodies, and the families began to dance and sing chants that were part of the African community. During the colonial period times, slavery of the Europeans wanted to make sure that the African American community did not revolt against what they had going in the colonies. So they began to silence those that mourned, and there was great death of the slaves due to sickness and disease during this time. Hush harbors were formed in secluded areas like swamps and forestry. The African Americans would wet quilts and towels to muzzle the sound of their mourning because they could not mourn out loud. They would also use buckets of water, place their heads into the water so that the water would muffle the sound as they cried for the loss of their loved ones. African Americans also during this time in the hush harbors formed circles of prayer around the pastor. Everyone would kneel down and they would face the ground as to wail and to cry and say their prayers and their last goodbyes into the ground where the loved one was placed. They would also sing chants and songs such as "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming Forth to Carry Me Home." The African American funeral through time. A change in time from the Egyptian customs to the 1500s with African rituals, the 1600s when slaves were brought to the Americas. We went into the 1700s with African Americans being able to join the military. During this time, there was still great slavery and African Americans were abused. This led to mass graves because there was not only death by opposition, there was also death by slave owners and plantation owners during this time. During the 1800s, however, with the Civil War, burials began to change. The embalming process began to change. And African Americans were able to be buried and embalmed. During the pandemic, we saw in 2019, COVID-19 caused major changes in the African American funeral services. One major change was social distancing. In the African American community, families socialized during funeral times. They hugged, they cried together, they laughed together. Being 6 feet apart caused lots of mental anguish during this time because families were not able to mourn as they normally would in the African American community. You also had to wear masks to these services, and the singing and the homegoing celebrations were limited because of the mask mandates. Also, the burials in the cemeteries. There were only allowed 10 people, including the pastors, during this time. One of the traditions of the African American funeral is for the family to be gathered around the tent, for those to pay their respects to their loved ones by placing flowers into the graves. None of these things were allowed during COVID-19. Then and now, we have come a long way in the African American history of the funeral. From the replicas of Pharaoh and the Egyptians carrying the caskets over their heads and singing their own songs, to wagon trails followed by African Americans who wept and wailed, to what we now have African American funeral homes with fleets of cars, coaches, and limousines. We also went from mass graves of African Americans who were treated as property and not given proper burials. Those burials also had to take place at night because they were not allowed to mourn the death of their loved ones while they were busy on the plantation. A lot of those that embalmed or performed these burial ceremonies during the day had to bury their white owners with respect that they knew was due their own ancestors. We moved to the daytime burial, one person per grave in a coffin or casket. And now we see celebration in places like New York and the African Burial Ground National Monument that memorializes and honors those slaves that were placed in mass graves that were unmarked. Important people in the African American funeral. Prince Greer was the first recorded African American embalmer during the Civil War. He was the personal slave of a Confederate cavalry officer who was killed in Tennessee. Greer, because he did love his slave owner, took his body and returned his master to the undertaker in Nashville, Dr. W. P. Cornelius, and he helped him embalm his owner, and he also started an apprenticeship with him where he learned to do all of the embalming for African Americans during the Civil War. The Black funeral homes and parlors. One of the most noted is the A.D. Price Funeral Home in Richmond, Virginia, which was among one of the first African American businesses established in the United States of America. One of the most famous funeral homes is the E.F. Boyd Funeral Home in Cleveland, Ohio, which was founded in 1905. This funeral home is noted for being a fifth generational, multi-million-dollar funeral home company with several locations at this time. Also, the James Wood Funeral Parlor was founded in 1928. These funeral parlors were very prestigious and led to many changes in our industry. Major impact on the industry. Burial societies and pre-needs. The burial societies formed in the 1900s by Black churches allowed societies to collect money from church members to pay for their funerals, coffins, graves, and plots in the event of their death. The burial societies were a forerunner for what we now know as pre-need funeral plans, where a person can pay in advance or monthly toward a funeral. These prices are guaranteed. Funeral parlors. Among the first black businesses opened after slavery was abolished. These parlors were usually located in the bottom floor of the African American home. People would lay in state in front of the fireplace, and the loved ones would sit in black and mourn and celebrate. This led to the repast celebration in the African American community and also the dinners after the wakes. This also led to the owning of African American operated funeral homes. Our references. Thank you.